So we've talked about discretionary and fiscal policy, and we've talked about how fiscal policy consists of government spending and taxation. So now let's look at the different philosophies as to when you would use government spending and taxation. When would you change those? So we're focusing here on our discretionary fiscal policy and our automatic fiscal policy, and when would you implement them? When would you use them? Well, with counter-cyclical fiscal policy, you're trying to counteract the business cycle. And so in this case, we're going to use government spending and taxation to close the gaps. All right, so if we have a recessionary gap, so let's first draw a recessionary gap, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, recessionary gap, so potential GDP, or the long run aggregate supply is going to be to the right of our actual GDP. So if we have a recessionary gap, we would close the gap by making government spending go up and net taxes go down. If we had an expansionary gap, here let's draw an expansionary gap, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Our potential GDP is to the left of actual GDP. So here's where we really are, and there's the potential. And so to close the expansionary gap, we need aggregate demand to decrease. So government spending would go down, tax would go up. So counter-cyclical fiscal policy wants to counteract the business cycle by closing the recessionary and expansionary gaps. So government spending goes up and taxes go down when there's a recessionary gap. And when there's an expansionary gap, government spending goes down and taxes go up. Now, the challenge with this approach to fiscal policy is that it can create a crowding out effect. The crowding out effect occurs when you already have lots of debt. So if you have lots of debt, as we said before, nobody wants to lend you money. And if nobody wants to lend you money, you have to entice people to lend you money by raising interest rates. Well, if interest rates are higher and you are trying to close a recessionary gap, so you're trying to stimulate the economy, and you're trying to stimulate the economy with more government spending that you have just financed with more debt at a higher interest rate. Well, the problem is that increase in the interest rate does what to investment spending? Well, a higher interest rate means it's more expensive for a business to borrow, so businesses are less likely to expand and buy capital goods and more inventory. So the problem is you're trying to close the recessionary gap by increasing government spending, but that increase in government spending is crowding out investment spending. And it's because we're financing that government spending with debt, driving up the interest rate, which causes investment spending to go down. So if the government spends more, and they already have lots of debt, higher interest rates mean investment spending go down, and these two just end up canceling each other out. It doesn't stimulate the economy like we planned. So having too much debt can create a problem with using fiscal policy to help close those gaps. The second type of fiscal policy is the balanced budget approach. The balanced budget approach uses automatic fiscal policy to help smooth out the business cycle. That is, we assume that the economy is capable of returning back to full employment without discretionary fiscal policy. So the balanced budget approach is really more of the classical approach, but not purely classical because there is government intervention, but not government intervention in terms of discretionary fiscal policy. Whereas the counter-cyclical approach is very much a Keynesian approach in closing the gaps. With the balanced budget approach, then we're going to let automatic fiscal policy right? That were things like the progressive tax system, EI, the fact that subsidies are tied to commodity prices. That's going to help lop off the extremes on our business cycle, okay? Now, the focus then is on maintaining a balanced budget. The challenge with maintaining a balanced budget is that during a recession, people's income goes down. And since their income goes down, tax revenue will decline as well. You got less money on your paycheck, it's going to push you into a lower tax bracket. Okay? Well, if you're attempting to balance the budget during a recession, the ways to do that are to cut government spending because you don't have as much tax revenue, or to raise taxes since you are getting less per person. If you raise the rates, then you can counteract that and get more. Well, the problem is if you're doing this to balance the budget during a time when the economy is contracting, decreasing government spending and increasing taxes will only make the economy contract even more. So it has a pro-cyclical effect. We push the economy in the direction it is already going. So there's a third philosophy on how to use fiscal policy. And what it attempts to do is it attempts to take the best of the two previous philosophies. So we want to use counter-cyclical fiscal policy to help close the gaps. We want to use automatic fiscal policy to prevent the extremes. And we do want to balance the budget because we know that having too much debt creates all kinds of problems for our economy. So the third approach is what is called the cyclical balanced budget approach. The cyclical balanced budget approach attempts to balance the budget, but not every year. Instead, it attempts to balance the budget over the life of the business cycle. The idea is that when the economy is expanding, that is when you should be paying down the debt. That is when you should be accumulating surplus. So when times are good, people should be paying more in taxes, and the government doesn't have to spend as much to stimulate the economy. So we're going to have surpluses and we're going to start paying down the debt. When the economy is contracting, then to stimulate the economy, the government is going to spend more and tax revenue is going to fall. And so we're going to have deficit spending here. But it's okay because when times are good again, we're going to pay it back down. Now, the problem with this theory is that it assumes that the good times are in equal size and magnitude as the bad times. So a year of contraction, a year of expansion. That the economy grows by 5% during the expansionary period and the economy contracts by 5% in the contractionary period. So they could balance each other out and we can balance the budget over the life cycle or the life of the business cycle. That's not always the case. Sometimes that contractionary period is much longer than the expansionary period. Now, when it comes to which philosophies we use in Canada, there are a number of provinces that have balanced budget requirements, in which case their focus is on decreasing government spending and raising taxes during those recessionary periods of time, which can hurt the economy. As a country, we have more of a cyclical balanced budget approach, at least in theory, where when the economy is growing, we're paying down the debt, and when the economy is shrinking, we are using counter-cyclical fiscal policy to help close the gaps. If you are using a cyclical balanced budget approach, what type of debt are you accumulating? Remember, we had structural and we had cyclical. So under the cyclical balanced budget approach, you have cyclical debt. You add to it in the bad times, you pay it off in the good times. So philosophy-wise, Canada tries to have a cyclical balanced budget and to maintain cyclical debt. But we have to be aware that if we look at our deficits, let's go way back in our notes. Back to the beginning. All the way back to the very, very beginning. Which is probably the page that won't load after all that. All right, let's close this and reopen it. We'll get our image back. But what we want to show is while we're trying to use that cyclical balanced budget approach, we have to recognize that 2008, 2009, economy contracted. 2015-16, economy contracted. So then we have to start to look at what did we do in the years of expansion. In those good years, are we paying down the debt? So let's just reopen our slides here once more. And let's just go to our slide here. And so you can see where in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the economy was doing well, we had a surplus and we're paying down the debt. So then we have to ask ourselves, since then, since 2005, we've had a deficit year after year. Now 2008, 2009 was a recession. 2015, 2016 was a recession. So then in between, as the economy started to recover, we didn't quite make it to a surplus. So then as we go forward over a number of years and the economy continues to grow, will we balance the budget and start paying down all of our debt?